When we are looking at inverse relationships, we're going to talk about how to solve for it algebraically. So I'm going to write out the steps here. Steps for solving for that inverse function. And I kind of started going over the steps in number 5. But it's a little different because we were using dollars and ounces, whereas we'll be using f of x or y or x. Our first step is going to be to switch your x and y variables. And I know we've been using function notation a lot, so I'd make a note that f of x and y are the same thing. Our second step is going to be to solve for y. And then label your inverse. So the way we write an inverse function is f to the negative 1 of x. So f to the negative 1 of x. That little notation is how we label an inverse. We might see some unique compositions of inverses. So if I put the original function into its inverse, it will undo each other and we'll be left with x. We're actually going to do an example of that and check for understanding. But an inverse and its original undo each other. They're opposites. I can say the same for this. If I were to plug in the inverse into the original function, they undo each other. They're opposites. We're going to do the check for understanding together. Is anyone still writing? I think to avoid some confusion, I'm going to use y for the money saved and x for hours. So can anyone help us out? If we want to know how much she saved total, y equals 13x plus 150, because that's what she got for her birthday. So that's her savings account equation. In part B, we're going to write the inverse of this. So I'm going to scroll up a little bit. In part B, we're going to write the inverse of this.
So x equals 150y plus 13.
Yep, so we're going to flip it. X equals 13y plus 150. Again, in part B, we're going to solve for the inverse. And I'm going to now solve for y after I flip it. So how would I start getting y alone? Yep, subtract 150. Divide everything by 13, and it's going to be a little messy. It's going to be a fraction. And I'm going to label this y with a little negative 1. So I know that this is my inverse function.
Will it always be a fraction?
Not always. Depends on the type of function we're starting with. Because it's linear, it will end up being a fraction. Part C says verify that these functions are inverses using composition. Oh man. So I'm going to take my original function and I'm going to input it in for my input. So I'm going to take my inverse equation and replace my original x with this and see what happens. So that's the setup to confirm this. What's 13? What's going to happen here in this fraction? Those cancel out. So those cancel out. And then what am I left with? But I'm adding 150. So you're just left with x, which is what we just did. We just did f of the inverse of this, and it cancels out and gives us x. Okay?
Is that like our checking?
Yeah, it's like checking. To make sure that the inverse is the true inverse, the actions should undo each other. We were timesing by 13, so the inverse is going to divide by 13.
So you should always
We should always get x at the end. Yep. Okay. Number 2. You guys ready? Number 2, I know for sure there's one of these on your test where you're interpreting an inverse from a table. You've got the temperature of hot chocolate in a mug. After t minutes, it was prepared. It's given by this function h of t, where h is measured in degrees Fahrenheit. Here's a table of values. My inputs are minutes. My outputs is how hot my hot chocolate is. This first one, we're just interpreting the value. So what does h of 13 mean in terms of my hot chocolate? You're right. At 13 minutes, the hot cocoa is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're just writing it out in a sentence to explain what's happening. Are we okay with that? Hot cocoa. Part B, we're going to do the inverse. The inverse of h. And inside is 107. So what do you think 107 is? It's degrees. Yeah, so now we're flipping our inputs and outputs. So when your hot cocoa is 107 degrees, what are we going to say? Yep, we're going to go find that value in the table. 5 minutes have passed. What's going to happen in part C? H of the inverse of h of 77. What's going to be left there? When I take, it cancels out. So what's going to be left? X this time? What's going to be left? 77. Those are opposites. They're going to cancel each other out. There's not an X this time, so I'm just left with 77. Okay? Inverses. Your homework is on the back of yesterday's.